Good evening, Malaysia, and followers from around the world. Tonight, we have a really special guest, Dr. Anjhula Mya Bais. She's one of the most sought-after speakers at the international platform, a remarkable lady of many talents. She's an international psychologist, feminist, supermodel, writer, activist, human rights advocate, and an influencer. She was selected as one of the 127 young global leaders class of 2019 by the World Economic Forum. More recently, she became the first person from Malaysia and India to become the chair of the International Board of Amnesty International, the world's largest human rights organization, and of course, a Nobel Prize winner. She studied psychology and philosophy at the prestigious feminist Lady Shri Ram College, University of New Delhi, which is the same alma mater of Aung San Suu Kyi, before doing her postgraduate studies from the University of College in London. She was then admitted into the prestigious Columbia University of New York, and she went on to complete her doctorate with distinction in international psychology from the Chicago School. We will be doing great injustice to her if we merely confine to a specific topic, as she wears many hats. She's a woman of many interests, many talents, and of course, we will ask her a broad range of issues. Welcome on board, Dr. Anjhula. I have a confession to make before we start this conversation, because I realized that you stay in Malaysia.
Indeed.
Where have I been? Okay. Where have I been? At least two women leaders in Malaysia called me up and said that, Chunwai, have you heard of Dr. Anjhula? And I said, I'm not too sure. I've got to do some checking. And when I look at the number and the huge amount of interviews that you have given to the foreign press, international credible foreign press, and I ask myself, Chunwai, what are you doing, man? You are totally cut off. So I said, I've got to give you a call, get hold of you, and to interview you for the sake of my little credibility.
Well, Chunwai, you know what? It's better late than never. But
Yes.
I'm so happy to be speaking with you today. Obviously, I've seen your programs, and I really admire your voice. And home is where the heart is. So home is Kuala Lumpur, and I'm happy to be speaking today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anjhula. Let us start by asking you this question, okay? So what does an international psychologist really do? And what is a trauma specialist? Because everyone refers to you on these two specific titles.
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I think anybody that's versed in the field of mental health, or has experienced mental health issues, or a mental health advocate, a lot of the times you hear about clinical psychology. That's more known, but clinical psychology, I mean, just roughly speaking, it had its antecedents in the global north. So sort of Freudian based, Viennese, European history. And the premise of international psychology is that a one size doesn't fit all. So a lot of times you'll have people that are trained in the global north and then come to, let's say, Asia or this part of the world, or the textbooks will be from there, but how does that fit into our culture, our ways of being, our indigenous understandings? It doesn't, because its histories are, rooted in a sort of European, North American hegemony. So international psychology posits that each nation state has its indigenous wisdom, and to understand the cultural context that you're in, so you'll get the best outcomes. So for example, when I was doing my doctorate dissertation, the rule was actually you have to do your doctorate dissertation on a country that's not America.
Okay.
Because all of the research, or the majority of the research and the publications in peer-reviewed scientific journals, is coming out of the United States from white undergraduate male students. How does that extrapolate to the rest of the world? It doesn't make sense.
Yes.
So my practice is, very culturally attuned. I think there's having the sort of theoretical and abstract knowledge, but there's an experiential knowledge of being on the ground. And, I've studied in the States. I love the States. There's no problem there. But you can even see by the amount of people that don't have a passport in America, that have not actually traveled outside of the world, and even in their history books, it's so US centric. So when I was studying in the US, sometimes people would ask me, I was wearing a necklace, for example, from my grandmother, and that's so beautiful. Where is it from? India. Is that next to Canada? Is their question, right? So it can be very problematic at times. It can be insular. And then a trauma specialist is exactly that. I literally have focused my specialty on trauma. Now, what people don't understand is there's almost two kinds of trauma. There's trauma with a capital T, which most people know about if you're coming back from war, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, sexual assault. But then there's also trauma with a lowercase t. So that can be a toxic workplace, passive aggressive bosses, a very disruptive home environment, daily pressures, right? That actually can exert more influence and trouble than the capital T. So those are some of my focus.
Okay, now, what made you study psychology as a first degree and until you got a doctorate? Why this particular subject?
Well, I mean, that's also a good question. I think, if you look back in your life, all the moments, they start to connect. When I was 14 years old, I mean, ever since then, I knew I wanted to be a psychologist. And I think there's just an ease that people have with me on average. I'm not scared of people. And I know that will sound like a very interesting comment to make, but you can't imagine how many people are sort of conflict avoidant, afraid to, they rather shelter or keep with people that are very like-minded and sort of have echo chambers. People don't scare me. People would gravitate towards me, tell me their problems. But obviously, it's not as simple as that. A lot of people, for example, will have an undergraduate degree or, get a diploma online and they're like, I'm a psychologist. And it's far more than that. You have to do years of study, laboratory experience, research, of course, a dissertation that's hundreds of pages, and it teaches you to critically think. And it's something that came quite naturally to me. So,
Dr. Anjhula, you come from a very noble family. You're of you come from a royal family of India, and that, of course, like many Asian parents, including mine, they expect their children to be doctors, engineers, and you have siblings who are doctors. So when you told your parents you wanted to do psychology, was there any kind of reaction or reservation from them?
Well, I mean, yes, there was. I suppose it could have been, if I wanted to look at the positive, it could have been worse. If at one point, just to sort of rattle my mom, it was when I was a teenager, I told her that I was going to marry somebody that wrote poetry, and she started crying, right? Because as Asians will get it. What is that? What is poetry? There's no job security. Where is the prestige? All of that. That's a commonality that's unfortunately prone in this part of the world. Yeah. I was actually admitted to med school, and I was going to go the psychiatry track, which is an MD. Mm-hmm. But and I definitely believe, of course, in science and medicine, no doubt. But I was also concerned, at least in the United States, by how much people just write a prescription and there you go. You have this issue, here's a pill, you have that issue. I mean, there was a New York Times bestselling book called Prozac Nation. Prozac being one of the #1 sort of medicines for antidepressant. And though medicine has its place, I also thought it's really important to do the long-term work, which is the scope of psychology. So I switched. Was my mom pleased? No. But now that she sees my career, she couldn't be more proud.
Yes. I have been following some of the recent interviews of yours. A lot of these American and other international TV stations have called you up to ask for your views on the issue of climate change and its impact on psychology. And that was when it caught my attention. And many of the leaders who have spoken up on the advocating climate, advocating better environment changes, they told me that, RealChunWai, you better speak to Anjhula, because that she's going to give you a very fresh perspective on how climate change has impacted not just physically on our Earth, but as well as the psychology of human beings. Can you elaborate on this, please?
Yeah, of course. So it's interesting what you say when you say, of course, climate change has its impact on Earth, but we are connected with Earth. We're connected with nature, and it's actually our disconnection from that that has led to this problem. And of course, at first glance, you're right. People would say, well, what does the climate have to do with mental health? But it has a lot to do with it. So I speak often to young people, in their early 20s, teenagers. And I must say, to sound like a millennial, they're, hashtag very woke, awakened people, really. And they're justifiably angry at the world that their elders have left them, the preceding generations. Because if you think about climate change, and here's the issue. For example, if you hit somebody, you right away, there's a cause and there's a effect. There might be a bruise, a red mark, they're angry. You do something, you see the effect. With climate change, people were doing irresponsible things in the 70s, and now we're seeing the effect. So there's a delay, which is very hard for our minds to grasp. But for, a lot of times when I'm speaking to young people in therapy, they don't feel like studying for their exams. They feel listless, they have anxiety, and their parents just dismiss that as, it's a phase. They're being stubborn, they're being difficult, but that's actually not the reason. They're literally, the apathy is like, why should I even study? What difference does it make, exams, SPM, A levels, O levels, when there's not going to be a world left? And so in 2019, I had the most extraordinary opportunity. I was selected by the World Economic Forum with 20 other people from around the world to go to Greenland and to study the climate crisis in real time with leading climate scientists. And I saw, it's a very rare scientific event. I saw an iceberg that was the size of a skyscraper. I saw it crack in half, and it actually cracked in half and fell into the water. And then the waves actually reached like tsunami level height. And my colleagues actually started running because, for their life. And it was so real to see that. And it changed my life. And a lot of times, again, in this part of the world, people will say human rights, feminism, climate change, such Western things, who cares? But when I came back to Malaysia, it's about culturally attuning the message. I said, in 10 years, it's going to be so hot because of the climate crisis, you can't travel to Mecca for your prayers. And then all of a sudden people are listening because it's very real. So there's almost this, like, for example, if you lose somebody and they die, you're sad and you have bereavement. But people are actually having ecological grief because of what's happening. Malaysia is a very popular diving site, but these diving sites are being disturbed because of climate and environmental degradation. So it's something, whether you're, a head of state or you're a stay-at-home parent, it's something everybody needs to get behind. It could be as simple as reduce your shower from 10 minutes to 5 minutes. Look at how much water you're saving. So if we all do it, we can still turn the clock.
Doctor, a few years back, some of the world leaders would dismiss all this talk about the climate change. They didn't want to believe it. And even though if they believe it, they know that they could not make it to work in their countries, like the implementation of taxes, will been resisted by their citizens. Now, the talk about climate change has become much more louder. When you talk about the impact on the human beings and psychology, is there still a sense of disbelief? Is it, oh no, I don't believe it, that it has an impact on our psychology? Do you still have that problem at this stage now?
Not as much, but I think with anything, you're going to always have skeptics. You'll have skeptics that don't believe in vaccines. You'll have skeptics that don't believe in the climate crisis. And while, views can and need to be aired, sort of democratically within reason, we cannot wait until it's too late. And the interesting thing about human beings on average is it takes your own experience before you move. And that's actually quite foolish. Like you can learn from other people's experience. The science doesn't lie. And so one of the greatest ways to see that, like, for example, just as simply as, farmers in Zimbabwe, they're like, we used to always need blankets at wintertime. But so strange, for the past 3 years, grandparents are saying this without any, scientific background. They're like, that's interesting. For 3 years now, at wintertime, we don't need a blanket. What do you think that is? And the people that are facing the brunt of that are always women, children, poor people. and, people in rural areas. So, and I
Yeah.
understand what you're saying about implementation is always hard,
Yeah.
but we need to gather not only political will, but also the will of the population. We're all in this together. There's an African
Yes.
saying, the sun doesn't discriminate. It shines on people equally. Climate crisis, just like COVID, is not going to say, oh, you're from this social economic status, you're fine. It will get
Yeah.
everybody. So we all need to come together.
I want to share something with you. For the past few years, I've been talking to my friends who lives in Finland and in Iceland. And for the past 2 years, they've been telling me that, ChunWai, it's already October, it's already November, and there's not much ice. Yeah. And those who are involved in the tourism industry, they have a hard time trying to cater to customers who have booked in, and they arrived and they found that there was just not enough ice. Yes. And they had this problem for a couple of years. This time they told me it was much better, but simply because the weather has become very unpredictable, but ice has become an issue in these countries. So you can imagine, these are very practical things for them. Now, I want to move on to another topic. I know that you've been asked about this quite a lot, but since I'm interviewing you for the first time, so you have to forgive me, okay? I want to ask you about your involvement in modeling at the age of 17 or 18 when you in UCL. How did you get started?
Oh, how did I get started?
Yeah.
So, I mean, when I was 14, I was walking around with my sister, and I was stopped by a modeling scout, a modeling agent, who was like, you should model. And my sister, being an older sibling, is like, absolutely not. No, you're way too young. And that was really good advice. And then when I turned 18, again, I accidentally, serendipitously became scouted. And then one of the first things I did was a ad campaign for Banana Republic. And then it just took off from there. So, had a global career, and then sort of any city that I was living and schooling in, I would model on the side.
This was in London.
This was everywhere. When I was in India doing my undergraduate, okay. I was an MTV VJ. I was doing commercials for Pepsi. Okay. In London, I was walking London Fashion Week. And when I was at Columbia University, I would take the train, go down for auditions, come back, take my makeup off, and go into my neuroscience class. So I've always balanced it. And even now, though much limited, I'm much more selective, and I don't have, time to do it as much. I will be very selective for the campaigns that I do.
So by the time you were doing it in India and in London, you had already signed up with an agency?
Yes, I was with Elite Model Management.
Okay. Yeah. So you're already a professional model by then?
Yes.
Okay. Did you enjoy all this catwalks? Do you still miss it? I know you're still doing it selectively, but do you miss all this glamour life?
No, and the reason I say that is I try to practice the Buddhist principle of non-attachment. So what comes, what goes. And I'm not holding on to it. That's what causes suffering. When people are like, I used to look like this and I used to do that, and you're stuck in your glory days. And I always think your glory days are literally right now. So like in this moment, I'm so enjoying our interview, and it's such a delight, and it's a lovely thing to do on a Sunday. I'm not thinking about the next interview or past. It's just where we're at right now. But I will say, I like the control that I have. And by that, I don't mean control and power in the traditional sense. I mean the empowerment that comes from the fact that I'm at complete liberty. I mean, when I was modeling back in the day, I was a broke student like everybody else. And, it's just like, everybody. Now I'm much more in control of what I select and why I select it. So for example, if a jewelry brand offers me a campaign, the first thing I'm not going to say how much. I'm going to be like, well, how do you source your diamonds? Are they conflict diamonds? Are they ethical? And now when I'm on magazine covers, it's not just for my face. They always interview me on the inside because I have so much to say, and I've done a lot.
Have you ever been approached by anyone to be a Bollywood actress?
So many times. I thought the scripts were ridiculous. I literally have told some of the most famous directors in Bollywood, and they're like, who is this girl with an attitude? But it was literally my point of view that you could not pay me enough money to act that stupidly. But having said that, Bollywood has evolved a lot from the
Yes.
time, I was getting approached, whereby the scripts are, they have much more depth. They're meaningful. It's much more than wearing a wet sari and running around a
Yes.
tree. So,
That's all gone.
I have a lot of friends, of course, in Bollywood, and a lot of times there's, what about a cameo? And if it's the right thing, I'm open to it. But the interesting thing is I edit a lot of Bollywood scripts for psychological accuracy.
Okay.
Yeah.
They need to give you a role where you play yourself.
They say that so many times. I actually have a filmmaker who's like, I'm wrapping up this film and then I'm literally making a film about you. I'm like, we'll see.
I read one New Delhi newspaper. You appear on the front cover, and they describe you as a feminist with who wears a lipstick. Okay, how did you end up becoming a feminist and that tag?
I mean, I don't know. It's probably the fact that I incorporate feminist principles in everything I do. So whether it's chairing the board or even in therapy sessions, the feminist principles of, not power, but empowerment, not afraid to get political, self-care, all of that infuses my thinking and my writing. So that's probably why they said that. And, I'll just be very clear to the viewership that a lot of times feminism gets a reputation of hating men, and it's not about that. It's about equality. There's a lot of men, including my husband, who are feminists, who are greatest gender allies. And there's also a lot of women who are anything but feminist because they uphold painful realities for women. So a lot of times in therapy, for example, I will hear about how mother-in-laws are giving their daughter-in-laws a very hard time, saying, you did not give me a grandson, that patriarchal thinking. So it's not about gender, it's about mindset. You could be a feminist, it doesn't matter.
Yes, call me in. Tell the husband, call me in, okay? Because that in my house, there's my wife, my daughter, my mom-in-law, my maid, okay, and 3 female dogs, okay? I'm the only male in the house.
Good. I'm sure you're learning a lot.
Oh, I'm pampered. Dr. Anjhula, now, you know that you live in India for a long time, and that you went on to live in UK and the US, and of course, India is described as a land of contrast. We have we have professional women, and of course, in the rural area, the Indian women do face a lot of hurdles and a lot of obstacles. As you have mentioned, we have many cases of people being molested, raped, and where the husbands do not treat them well. And of course, there's this caste system. There is a land of contrast. I mean, you speak on feminist issue in India. How do you reconcile with all these issues in India?
Reconcile in what way?
In a way that how do you stand up for some of these women, especially those in rural areas who have got to cope with these obstacles in their life?
Yeah. Well, first I'd start off by saying that it's not unique to India. It's everywhere. It's rural, it's urban, it's as much in Malaysia as India, Sri Lanka, Singapore, everywhere. It will look slightly different with, sort of religious, social, cultural, geopolitical realities, but the oppression of women is a, sort of, unfortunately, a global issue. So one way is being a voice for people who don't have a voice. I mean, objectively speaking, I feel that education is not meant to be lorded over people, it's meant to empower people. So I've educated myself a lot, not to necessarily, I think an Asian parent thinking on average is, great career, lots of money. That's really not what that's about for both my husband and I. If anything, we're all about the giving pledge, which is all our net worth is just given away, right? We have no need to sort of keep it. So that's one aspect. But the other aspect is that when you haven't been afforded privileged opportunities, you actually have no idea of what your rights are. Do more rights need to be created? Yes, but there's also a lot of frameworks that a lot of leaders in some ways are counting on people not knowing. So you have no idea what your rights are, what you can actually do because you've been kept in the dark. So part of that is about really making people aware, which is why even an interview like this is quite helpful.
How did you get yourself involved in Amnesty International?
Oh, what a love story with Amnesty. So my first ever Amnesty action that I took was signing a petition on behalf of our beloved cartoonist Zunar, because with previous governments they were trying to curb his freedom of expression and even travel and assembly. And so that was in 2016. I've always been drawn to human rights. So I started as a volunteer at Amnesty International Malaysia. Then I ran for elections and I made it to the board of Amnesty Malaysia, and they asked me to be the chairperson of Amnesty Malaysia. So I did that for 2 years. And then I ran for elections, and I got onto the international board of Amnesty and was the first person from Malaysia to do that. And then as of a month ago, I've had the extreme privilege of the international board voting and appointing me as a chairperson of the international board.
Well done.
Thank you.
When you moved to, before you moved to Malaysia, have you ever imagined that you'll be taking up so many roles from Kuala Lumpur as all these reporters will see on TV? And that did you ever imagine that you actually stay in Kuala Lumpur, work in Kuala Lumpur?
No, I did not imagine specifically Kuala Lumpur, but I would say I was always open. I think people constrict themselves too much. They have, and again, that's where suffering comes from. They have this idea of this is how my life should look like, and I'm very agile in that sense. So my in-laws have a third generation business conglomerate that is across Malaysia, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Singapore, India. So it was always a possibility.
Yeah.
And I cannot tell you how much I love Malaysia. It is very much.
And as the saying goes, have you gone Malaysian? Have you gone native?
Well, how do you define that? Do I love the food? And I mean, do I have my nasi lemak? Yes, I just had it today, actually, my usual Sunday meal. But I just think that in any country that you're in, any airspace that you breathe and the water you drink of said country, you must serve the people. And I have dedicated myself for over a decade in serving the people of Malaysia. It is my country. And I think that is quite obvious that, naturally, like when the Olympics come on, my husband was just watching and I could not help but like scream and cheer when the Malaysian athletes came. So that just tells you automatically where my heart is.
Well, certainly Malaysia is privileged to have you here. Now, one final word from you before we sign off. And of course, we're going to talk about the mind. The mind does matters. You study psychology, and that you're a psychologist, and we all know that the mind controls everything. It relates to everything. Can you have a last final word from you before we wrap up?
Absolutely. So I would probably stay away from necessarily using the word control, because people have a very interesting relationship with control. I would just say that the mind shapes a lot. So for everybody that's listening, it is so easy to blame your boss, blame your boyfriend, blame your spouse, blame your friend. And I'm not saying at all that, external environmental factors don't have an impact. They certainly do. But in life, it is not about what someone has said or done, and it is not about what has happened to you that has an effect. What has an effect is how you think about it. So you are always in the driver's seat. If you can change how you think, if you can cultivate a new way of thinking, the sky is actually limitless.
Thank you, Dr. Anjhula. To all the viewers who are watching this, thank you for finding time to listen to both of us. And please follow, like, share, and subscribe to RealChunWai, and of course, Dr. Anjhula. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.